Hello, hello. This is the reading of the book Solitary by Albert Woodfox. Unbroken by 4 decades in solitary confinement, my story of transformation and hope. The prologue, February 19th, 2016. I woke up in the dark. Everything I owned fit into 2 plastic garbage bags in the corner of my cell. When are these folks going to let you out? My mom used to ask me. Today, Mama, I thought. The first thing I'd do is to go to her grave. For years, I'd lived with the burden of not saying goodbye to her. That was a heavy weight I'd be carrying. I rose and made my bed, swept and mopped the floor. I took off my sweatpants and folded them, placing them in one of the bags. I put on an orange jumpsuit required for my court appearance that morning. A friend had given me street clothes to wear for later. I laid them out on my bed. Many people wrote to me in prison over the years, asking me how I survived 4 decades in a single cell, locked down 23 hours a day. I turned my cell into a university. I wrote to them, a hall of debate, a law school. By taking a stand and not backing down, I told them. I believed in humanity, I said. I loved myself. The hopelessness, the claustrophobia, the brutality, the fear, I didn't say. I looked out the window. A news van was parked down the road outside the jail, headlights still on, though it was getting light now. I'll be able to go anywhere, to see the night sky. I sat back on my bunk and waited. Chapter 1, in the beginning. I was born in the Negro wing of the Charity Hospital in New Orleans, and the day after Mardi Gras, February 19th, 1947. My mom, Ruby Edwards, was 17. My father was gone. He left her, she told me, because she was from the wrong side of the tracks. We lived in New Orleans until I was 5. My mom fell in love with a man named James B. Mabel, a chef in the U.S. Navy. He was the first and only man I ever called daddy. They got married and had 4 more children, a girl and 3 boys. We moved 6 or 7 times to different naval bases during those years. Daddy's job was to feed the crew of whatever ship he was assigned to. He used to take me on ships on the weekends when Navy personnel were allowed to bring family. I remember walking to the edge of an aircraft carrier to see the water, and he grabbed me by the back of my shirt so I wouldn't be blown away by strong winds. I was a rebellious child. When I was 7 or 8, I challenged my mom to a wrestling match. I can beat you, I told her. If I win, you have to wear a dress all day, she said. It was the worst punishment I could think of, but I agreed. She pinned me in a few seconds. I don't know where she got the dress, but I wore it. At least I was keeping my word, she said. A man ain't nothing without his word, she told me. I heard that my whole childhood. For a while, my mom was my world, proud, determined, and beautiful. She took care of us. She couldn't read or write, but she could add and subtract and was good with money. She could squeeze a penny until it screamed. Growing up in the Jim Crow South, she had a lot of practice surviving on very little. When Daddy was on leave, we stayed at his parents' small farm where he had grown up in LaGrange, North Carolina. There, my grandparents grew watermelons, cabbage, corn, tobacco, and sweet potatoes. Behind the house was a chicken coop, and further back, a forest where we picked wild strawberries. My grandmother loved to fish, but was afraid of boats. I was the only one who trusted to row her out into the river, which my mom, being from Louisiana, we called the bayou. My grandmother showed me how to clean and cook the fish we caught. She taught me how to farm. I fed the chickens and worked in the fields. I learned to drive a team of mules at a very early age. When we chopped tobacco, I drove a slender buggy led by a mule that fit between rows of tobacco. The sides of the buggy were made up of cut-up burlap sacks, nailed to the posts that stuck from each corner of the wagon. Nailed to posts that struck up from each corner of the wagon. The women in the field broke off the leaves and laid them down flat in the buggy. When the buggy was full, I drove it to the curing barn where the women tied and hung the tobacco on sticks that were then placed inside the barn on racks. Once the barn was full, the heat was turned on and the tobacco would be cured before being shipped and sold to tobacco factories. When I was 9 or 10, I'd hitchhike back and forth to a job at a tobacco factory in Winston-Salem, 170 miles each way. Sometimes the driver would make up conversation, other times they wouldn't. My job was to help roll the tobacco barrels to a scale. A lot of kids my age worked there. When I was 11, everything changed. Daddy was forced by the Navy to retire after 25 years, and we moved to LaGrange full time. He went from being a master chef petty officer, the highest non-commissioned rank you can achieve in the Navy, to being a Black man living on a farm in North Carolina. Without the responsibility and respect he was given in the Navy, he lost his self-esteem. He started drinking and took his frustration and rage out on my mom. Daddy never hit me or my brothers or sister. He beat my mom. When he hit my mom, she screamed and tried to fight back. but she was a small woman. He overpowered her with his size and strength. We never knew when he was going to explode in anger and bitterness. Nothing warned us in advance how he would react on any given day, so we lived in constant confusion and fear. One time, he beat my mom so badly, his sisters came around and told her that they were afraid for her life. If she didn't leave, they said, he might kill her. My mom didn't want to go, but some part of her knew if she stayed with Daddy, she was in danger. Sooner or later, the violence he used against her might be used against her children. She made a secret plan with Daddy's sisters to take us kids and run away. Because of her limited education experience, the only place she felt safe was in New Orleans, where she was born and raised. So New Orleans was her destination. On the day Mama planned for us to go, Daddy was getting ready to leave the house when my 5-year-old sister Violetta said she wanted to go with him. My little brother James, who was 3, said he wanted to go too. Mama spoke to Violette. "Why don't you stay home, Bee? I think you should stay." Violetta was Daddy's favorite child, and he said she could go with him. James could come too. We all watched them walk out the door. Mama turned to my aunties and said, "I ain't going, not without my children." They told her in the strongest words possible that she had to leave because her life and the lives of her children depended on it. They promised they'd send Vi and James along behind us with someone. It was the hardest decision my mom ever made. She took me, my brother Haywood, who was 2, and the baby, Michael, not even a year yet, to the Greyhound bus station. We boarded the bus and drove all the way to New Orleans without Vi and James. Mama cried off and on the whole way. She was filled with anger, fear, and remorse because she felt as though she had abandoned 2 of her children, even though she knew she'd see them in a matter of days or weeks. She never imagined that years would pass before she would see them again. Had she known, our lives would have been different because she never would have left. At the bus station in New Orleans, Mama called her brother on a payphone. Uncle Joe came to get us with Auntie Gussie. They drove us to a house she was renting. I'll never forget the address, 918 North Villiers Street in the 6th Ward. Inside, Aunt Gussie led us down a long hallway to 2 small rooms in the back. One of the rooms had a fireplace and became our makeshift kitchen. Mama put a bunk in there for me and my brothers. She took the other rooms as her bedroom. In order to use the toilet, we had to walk out of the front door and around the house to the backyard. It was located in a little room attached behind the house. There was a bathtub and a small room that separated Aunt Gussie's kitchen from our 2 rooms. My mom always made us take baths in a big metal tub in our kitchen. Mama warmed up water on the little stove and poured it in a tub for us. There was a slop jar in the counter we used as a temporary toilet at night. We put pine oil in it to keep down the odor. One of our chores each morning was to empty the slop jar. The city of New Orleans is made up of wands, and we lived in the 6th ward, made up of wards, and we lived in the 6th ward, also called the Treem. It was a Black neighborhood in those days, a mix of working class and poor people. We lived in the poor section. Claiborne Avenue was the busiest street in the Treem because most of the businesses in the 6th ward were located there. It was our Canal Street, the main business area of New Orleans. Small Black-owned businesses like grocery stores, hair salons, dress shops, laundromats, barbers, bakeries, and bars lined Claiborne Avenue. The middle of Claiborne was covered in grass and trees and called neutral ground. It was a favorite gathering place of people in the neighborhood during Mardi Gras season and other holidays. Everyone set up barbecue pits and picnics on neutral ground. After school, my friends and I played tackle football there and in the shade of the trees that lined Claiborne. When we weren't playing on neutral ground, we played stickball on the streets. If it wasn't too hot, children played barefoot, saving their shoes for school. Almost all the houses in the 6th ward were the same. We called them shotgun houses. If you stood at the front door and fired a shotgun, the ball shot would go straight out the back door. Our house was a double shotgun. Each house on the street had a small porch or steps in the front where people gathered. Telephone poles were on either side of the street with sagging, crisscrossing wires between them. There wasn't a tall building in sight except for a church steeple here and there and Joseph A. Craig Elementary School. Every house had a side alley lined by a fence. My friends and I jumped the fences to take shortcuts from street to street. Later, we jumped fences running from the police. My mom wanted the best for us, but since she was functionally illiterate, she couldn't get what would be considered a regular job. So she took odd jobs and did whatever was necessary to provide for us, and sometimes that included prostituting herself. Only 28 when we moved back to New Orleans, and in spite of having 5 children, my mom was still a very beautiful woman. She worked in bars and nightclubs as a barmaid, hustling tricks and rolling drunks. Outside, there was poverty, but inside our house, my mom created an oasis for us. She always made enough money to buy us clothes, put food on the table, and pay Aunt Gussie rent. She cared a lot about making sure we had clothes that fit. Most of the kids I grew up with wore hand-me-down clothes that were too big or too small. Some kids wore pants that stopped at the ankles. We called them ankle whippers. Mom told us that she wanted us to have better than what she had when she was a child. She always got us something new to wear for the first day of school. I didn't realize until I was much older the sacrifices she made that give us these basic necessities. She used to say, I don't want my children to do things I have to do to make a living, and I want my children to have a better life. But sometimes our need to survive poverty got in the way. When money was tight and there was no food in the house, I shoplifted bread and canned goods. It never felt like a crime to me. It was survival. In every way, we made do. For some meals, Aunt Gussie and I would fish from perch or mullet in Bayou St. John. If my shoes had holes on them, if my shoes had holes on the bottom, I put a layer of newspaper inside so I could still wear them. I was proud though. I didn't want anyone to see the holes in my shoes. At church, when it was time to kneel, I would half crouch, kneeling on one knee so I could keep the shoe with the holes flat on the floor so nobody behind me would see the holes. One time a nun walked to the end of my pew and loudly told me to kneel on both knees. When I wouldn't do it, she ordered me to come out of the aisle between the pews. I walked to where she was standing, and once again, she ordered me to kneel. Now everyone was looking at me. If I knelt, the whole congregation behind me would see the holes in my shoes. I refused. She grabbed my collarbone and tried to force me to my knees. When I resisted, she told me to get out. I went back to church, sometimes with my mom, but I never forgot the cruelty of that nun. Aunt Gussie went to a Baptist church. Sometimes she took me to a gospel concert at her church, and I enjoyed the harmonies and voices. Aunt Gussie used to give me $1 on Thursdays to go get her a blessed candle from her church. One Thursday, on the way to get her a candle, I noticed her pastor in the corner store when I walked by. He was holding a box of full candles, which cost 50 cents each at the store. I followed him. I wanted to watch him bless the candles and expected to see him perform some kind of ceremony when he got to the church. But he just took the candles from the box and put them on the table for people to buy for $1. That was a shock because back in those days, 50 cents was a lot of money. I never believed in God, even as a child. I couldn't understand the idea of an all-powerful being, but I always considered myself to be spiritual. For me, spirituality is a feeling of connection beyond yourself. We had an old dog we called Trixie, and at times I felt as though I knew what Trixie was thinking. To me, that was spiritual. During the days, my brother and I were sometimes on our own. My mom might be sleeping off a hangover or was too exhausted to get up from hustling all night. Often she didn't get home until 6 in the morning. Sometimes I snuck into her room after she went to bed and hid the money she made that night, so if her boyfriend came around that day, he wouldn't get it. It didn't do any good. My mother was in love with a man. She would give him everything. She would give him anything she had, including her money. Aunt Gussie cooked and helped out. She did all chores, cleaning the floors, ironing our clothes. I remember pressing clothes with an old-fashioned iron that was heated on the stove. We learned to take care of ourselves. We always took care of one another. When I was 12, my baby brother Donald was born. His dad was a merchant marine named Pete, who had an on and off relationship with my mom for many years. Everything in those days was segregated between white and blacks. Black people weren't allowed to go to a lot of places because of Jim Crow laws. At the movies, black people could only sit in the balcony. We were barred from sitting in the seats downstairs. We weren't allowed to stand in the lobby or at the concession counter to buy popcorn or any of the other snacks. We had to wait by the lobby door until a white usher walked by so we could give him our money and order. The usher would bring back our change and candy or popcorn or whatever was left over at the concessions. The only time I really had contact with white people was when we went to the French Quarter or the shopping districts on Canal Street. The first time I felt that a white person could be a threat to me, I was standing at a bus stop at the corner of Dumaine and Villiers with my mom when two white police officers drove by in a patrol car. She put her hand on my shoulder protectively and moved me behind her. As I got older, I noticed white people would address black grown-ups as boy or girl, and I felt the disrespect of it. The first time I was called a nigger by a white person, I was around 12. I was waiting with dozens of other people at the end of Mardi Gras parade behind the municipal auditorium, where the people on the floats, who were all white in those days, gave away whatever beads and trinkets they had left. On one of the floats, the man tossing the trinkets was holding a real beautiful strand of pearl-colored beads. I thought they'd make a nice gift for my mom on her birthday. I called out to him, hey, mister, and reached out with my hand. He pointed to me as he held the beads above my head and tossed them towards me. As the beads came close to me, I reached up and a white girl standing next to me put her hand up and caught them at the same time I did. I didn't let go. I gestured to the man on the float and told her, hey, he was throwing the beads at me. I told her I wanted to give them to my mom. She looked at the man on the float who was still pointing at me. Then she ripped the beads apart and called me a nigger. The pain I felt from that young white girl calling me a nigger will be with me forever. Most of the policemen were white in those days. They came through our neighborhood, picking up black men for standing on the corner, charging them with loitering or vagrancy, vagrancy, looking to meet their quota of arrests. Once in custody, who knows what charges would be put on those men. My friends and I knew it would be whatever the police wanted. We always knew the police picked up the men in our neighborhood because they were black and for no reason. We never talked about it though. We couldn't have articulated racism if we tried. We didn't understand the depths of it, the sophistication of it. We only absorbed the misery of it. In sixth grade, I attended a social studies class that taught me my place in the world. We had an African-American teacher for a classroom of Black children who lived in the same all-Black neighborhood using a textbook that only depicted what was happening in white America. The pictures and stories in the textbook had nothing to do with our reality. It wasn't the first time I became aware that the white people had it better, but it was the first time it began to dawn on me that everybody knew white people had it better. It was the first time I understood that something was terribly wrong in the world and nobody was talking about it. In that same social studies class, I was taught that women like my mom, who worked in bars, were considered a disgrace to society. I had always detested the men my mom brought home, but until I took this class, I never judged her. It was just a way of life. I began to look down on her. I didn't realize at that time that my mom didn't have choices, that she worked in bars to take care of me and my brothers, and I was unforgiving. Deep down, I never stopped loving my mom, but I hated her too. One of the greatest regrets of my life was that I allowed myself to believe that the strongest, most beautiful, most powerful woman in my life didn't matter. Around this age, I started to hear stories about men in the Ku Klux Klan lynching Black people. Like all Blacks, I was scared to death of the Klan. I didn't venture much into the white community. For the most part, my friends and I stayed in the Black neighborhoods of New Orleans. It was where we felt safe. Eventually, it was where we committed our crimes. For a while, I went on to excel at school, in the classroom, and in sports. I was small for my age, but I was on the football team and the volleyball team. We didn't have a basketball team at my school, but we often played basketball in the park. Playing sports was the only time in my life I knew what to do at any given moment. But the lessons of the sixth grade had weakened me in a way I can't describe. I stayed in school for 3 more years, but somewhere inside of me, I was done with school. I turned my attention to the street. There, I quickly learned everyone had one choice: to be a rabbit or a wolf. I chose to be a wolf. We're still recording. My screen moved, so I didn't see my face here. Okay, 1960s. Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, 1960s. Chapter 2, The High Steppers. I started to hang with other boys in Shreve when I was around 12. I had a little job in the grocery store making snowballs, cups of shaved ice covered with flavored sugarcane syrup. When the owner wasn't looking, I handed out snowballs to my friends through the back window. At night, we stood under the streetlight on the corner of Germain and Robertson and talked shit for hours, boasting about things we never did, describing girls we never knew. Everyone called me Fox. After school, we'd meet up and figure out ways to get things we didn't have. We shoplifted bread from the boxes outside stores, snuck into the theater to watch movies. For money, we sang and danced in the French Quarter or stole flowers from the graveyard and sold them to tourists on Bourbon Street. To eat, we met at the bakery of Orleans Avenue before dawn and stole rolls and pastries from delivery trucks parked behind a tall barbed wire fence. It was nothing for us to climb over that fence if we had a pillowcase or cloth to protect our hands. We'd take a tray of baked goods from the back of one of those trucks, dump them into a bag, and run across the tracks to Brown Velvet's Dairy to steal milk or ice cream from their trucks. We carried everything to the park and ate until we couldn't eat anymore. When we heard about the concert playing at the municipal auditorium, we climbed up the back walls to an open second-floor window, ran down the back stairs, and charged kids admission at the back door. When the Ringling Bros Circus came to town, we signed up for day jobs to feed and water animals. We piled hay in front of the elephants and horses and shoveled shit from behind them and hauled water to tigers in cages. When nobody was looking, we'd leave our rakes and shovels in the straw, sneak off and find an unguarded back door where we charged for entrance, letting our friends in for free. We never thought we were committing crimes. We thought we were outsmarting the world, but we watched out for police. Sometimes they come after us if they saw a group of Black kids, no matter what we were doing. We had to especially be on the lookout in the French Quarter where we beat the box on Bourbon Street, drumming on cardboard boxes. If the police grabbed us in those years, they'd take our money and beat us until we ran away as fast as we could. My mom saw into the future and tried to protect me from going to jail. If I catch you stealing or doing anything wrong, I'm going to whip your ass, she'd say. I don't want you out there stealing and being a petty-ass criminal. If she saw me on the street with a kid she thought was trouble, she would come up to us and tell me to go home. At times, she'd yell at me and I'd yell back. I don't think she had any right to tell me what to do. I didn't think she had any right to tell me what to do. I didn't want her controlling me. We still had affectionate times some days when I would sit close to her and we'd talk with her, and we'd talk with her arm around me. She loved my hair. By age 13, though, I wasn't obedient to my mom anymore. She would tell me to be home at a certain time, and I wouldn't be home at that time. My friends and I were hustling to survive, and we loved being good at it. I call this period of my life the guilt of innocence. We didn't know any better. Around this time, we started to think of ourselves as a gang and started calling ourselves the Sixth Ward High Steppers, a name we thought made us sound like winners. Being in a gang, defending your turf becomes necessary. I had to learn to fight. I wasn't a natural born fighter, so I held back at first. Fighting actually made me physically ill. When I saw boys at my age fighting older, bigger kids, I thought they'd have something I didn't have. I wonder if I was a coward. My friend Frank had been pushing me to fight this dude my age named Lawrence, who was constantly humiliating me. If I was eating a sandwich, when he saw me, he'd take it and eat it. Once he took my belt. Mostly, he demanded I give him any money I had on me. I was terrified of Lawrence, who was bigger than me. You can't let him do that to you, Fox, Frank said. When are you going to stand up for yourself? The next time I saw Lawrence, it was in Orleans Avenue, neutral ground. I was scared, but this time, when Lawrence pushed me, I swung my arm and I hit him in the head. That's when I learned that courage doesn't mean you aren't afraid. Courage means you master that fear and act in spite of being afraid. Lawrence and I fought and didn't stop until I got up, and he didn't. For Lawrence and I fought and didn't stop until I got up, and he didn't. For a while, Lawrence and I fought every time we saw each other. Then he gave up. I never let fear stop me from doing anything again. We never wanted to get caught on anyone else's turf, but if there was a house party outside the Sixth Ward, we risked it. If confronted by another gang, we stayed and fought or hauled ass. When gang members from other wards came on our turf, we'd beat them up and chase them out. No one had guns at that time. We only fought with fists. Gang members never attacked the family members of other gang members. If there was a feud between gangs, it stayed within the gangs. It was understood that family was off limits. Everybody honored that. After every fight, I still felt ill and went off to be by myself, but I didn't tell anyone. By the time I was in my mid-teens, I had a reputation of being very tough. Only I knew differently. On hot summer nights when the mosquitoes were tearing our asses up, we broke into the pool next to the park and filled it with water. We turned on the lights by bending back the cover of the switch box to reach the switch. Then we started the water pump and let the water run until the pool was full. People came from the nearby projects to swim. Sometimes park officials would come around and turn everything off and tell everyone to go home. If the cops came, everybody broke out running. A child who got caught would be sent to juvenile hall. A grown-up would be charged with trespassing. Most of the time, the police didn't come. When we finished swimming, we drained the pool and turned the lights off. For the moment, we knew how to avoid the cops. Police cruisers circled the neighborhood at the same time every day like clockwork, and we wouldn't be out at those times. If police showed up unexpectedly, we'd go inside and slip down an alley to avoid them, or we'd scatter and run. We ran and were chased, even when we weren't doing anything wrong. I got really good at jumping fences when chased by the police. If they caught us for any real or imagined crime, they'd beat us with their fists and nightsticks or blackjacks, which we called flapjacks because they made a flapping sound when they hit us. They searched us looking for any money we had, pocketing what they found. For a while, they let us go. When we got older, they dragged us to juvenile hall. It never occurred to us to tell anyone they beat or robbed us. It was accepted. That was just the way of life at that time. When I was 14, my mom asked me if I wanted to meet my real father, Leroy Woodfox. I was surprised because I didn't know they were in touch. My first thought was no. All I knew was my biological dad was that he abandoned my mom when she was pregnant with me. Why? I asked. He said he'd like to meet you, she said. She gave me the address of his dry cleaning business, which was nearby. I wasn't really curious about him, but I thought he might give me some money, so I went. When I walked in, I saw him right away. I looked just like him. I can't remember what we talked about, but we didn't say too much. He offered to clean some clothes for me. A few days later, I took him some trousers and he tossed them onto a pile of clothes in the corner, telling me to come back in a couple days. When I went back to pick up my pants, I saw right away that they were still in the pile in the corner. I turned and walked out the door, leaving the pants behind. I never saw him again. One of my hustles was working the shrimp boats in St. Bernard Parish, carrying huge bags of shrimp and oysters to a warehouse. Inside the warehouse, women stood around a table shucking oysters into gallon-sized cans, juice and all, one after another. They could get through a bag of oysters faster than anything I'd ever seen. Some of my pay was in oysters and shrimp, which I take home. I think that warehouse is where I heard the Hurricane Carla was coming, and that when it touched down, it would be the storm of the century. I always like to stand in our backyard during a storm and listen to the rain and wonder what a hurricane would feel like. The hurricane slammed into Texas on September 11th, 1961, and spawned tornadoes that reached Louisiana. The morning of the storm, I made my way to Lake Pontchartrain, Pontchartrain, to the seawall steps where I'd play when I was younger. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. My mom would have kicked my ass if she knew. A low tide, 9 or 10 stone steps were visible coming up from the water's edge to the shore. When the tide was in, the steps were covered with water. By the time I got there, it was raining hard and the tide had come in. I looked for a place to stand. I figured the water wouldn't get over the wall, but to be sure, I crossed the lake road and stood against the sturdy tree, tying a rope around my waist to the tree so it wouldn't be blown away. I was already completely soaked from the rain. The wind hit me now mostly from the side. Usually Lake Pontchartrain is as flat as glass. I watched the giant waves develop out on the lake for some time. By the time I noticed the water had come up over the walls, it had already passed the grass and almost to the road that runs alongside the lake. I was surprised watching it creep across the road towards me. When the water covered my feet, I put my hands on the rope and ready to untie it. When it got to my knees, I untied myself and waded against the wind to the higher ground, then made my way home. Not long after that, my stepdad showed up at the house and dropped off my sister Violetta and my brother James. We hadn't seen them in 3 years. After he dropped them off, we never saw Daddy again. My mom gave V the top bunk and the boys shared the bottom bunk until she got a fold-out couch for V to sleep on. It was crowded, but I wasn't home much at night to sleep anyways. My brother Michael remembers me being around the house in those days, making sure that everybody got home after school and that everybody had dinner at night. My little brother Haywood says I was like Daddy to him. I hardly recall those times. I was consumed with what was going on outside. Soon, a new father figure came along for my brothers and sisters. His name was Jethro Hamlin. Everybody called him Pop Skeeter. He loved my mother. The saying was, if Ruby said jump, Pop Skeeter asked how high. A master carpenter, he built cupboards and shelves in our 2 back rooms to make them more livable. Pop Skeeter brought stability to my family. Years later, my mom and Pop Skeeter married. He stayed with her the rest of her life through thick and thin. The most money our gang ever made in those days was from illegally parked cars, an old hustle that was passed down from one generation to another. On weekend nights, my friend and I went to the French Quarter or around the municipal auditorium and waved down drivers looking for parking spots. In exchange for $1, we'd show the drivers where to park, directing them to illegal spots and alleys behind buildings, up hills, or even on neutral ground. We were amazed that people parked their cars wherever we told them to. We always said, be sure to lock your cars to gain their trust. We would make $50 parking cars on a good night. When the police were bored, they'd come around with police dogs for something to do. They knew we'd be there and try to sneak up on us. When someone saw them, he'd yell, police, and everybody would take off. Once, when I was running away, a canine dog caught me. One of the rewards for the canine dog in those days was what was referred to as give him a bite, when the officer stood by and let the dog bite the person he caught, usually while that person was lying on the ground. This policeman let his dog chew my thigh. Sometimes they let us go. Other times they took us to juvenile hall. Once in a while, the officers from juvenile hall raided our operations too. Some of the officers at juvenile hall were Black. One of them was Mr. Green, a substitute gym teacher at my school. He knew all of us. I see you, Wood Fox, he'd yell at me. There was no way he could catch me. I'll get your ass at school tomorrow, he'd yell. I'll call your mama. This was all part of the game. He and I both knew he wasn't going to call my mom. He wasn't going to get my ass at school the next day or any day. It was like we were acting out roles set in motion before time without knowing why. He was probably parking cars at my age. Threads like this ran throughout my childhood. History was always repeating itself. These threads held us together and kept us apart. My first arrest was for parking cars. Juvenile hall was a house on St. Philip Street. Desks and chairs where the officers sat were set up in what would have been the living room. The bedrooms were covered The bedrooms were converted into holding cells. Let's read this again. My first arrest was for parking cars. Juvenile Hall was a house on St. Philip Street. Desks and chairs where the officers sat were set up in what would have been the living room. The bedrooms were converted into holding cells. The windows on the first floor had bars, but they didn't think anyone would be crazy enough to jump out of the second floor, so they didn't put bars on the upstairs windows. Officially, you couldn't get out of Juvenile Hall until a grown-up came and signed you out. Sometimes when one parent came, they would sign out their child and all of his friends. I usually didn't sit around and wait to see who would come because I didn't want my mom to know I got arrested. I'd squeeze out a partially open window from the second floor holding room, hang from a window ledge, and drop to the ground. If my mom found out, she would be angry. She'd fuss at me, but there was nothing she could do. When I was younger, there might be an ass whipping with a switch or an ironing cord, but after a certain age, I wouldn't accept that kind of punishment anymore. In 10th grade, I was suspended from school for hitting a girl. It happened at a school assembly. I was head of my 10th grade homeroom, so I was on the stage with the girl who was class president. She told me in front of all the students that she had a problem with my shirt because it was untucked, which was the style then. I told her to mind her own business and she slapped me in the face. I took my seat on the stage. The humiliation of being slapped in front of everyone played over and over in my mind during the assembly. When the meeting ended, I picked up a folding chair from the stack and hit the girl who slapped me from behind, knocking her out. Thankfully, the girl was okay. The principal suspended me, though, and told me to show up at school the next day with my mother. When I got home, I didn't tell my mom what happened. I pretended to go to school every day for a year before she found out. After I was put out of school, I had more time on my hands and started taking more risks. With my girlfriends, I snuck into strangers' houses where they were out so we could be alone. I broke into stores at night and stole money directly from cash registers. Nothing in my days or nights were planned. I never considered the consequences of my actions. I had a lot of girlfriends, but I wasn't faithful or loyal to any of them. When I was 16, I went out with a very beautiful, naive, and impressionable girl I had gone to junior high school with, named Barbara. I got her pregnant. We weren't together when our daughter was born in January 1964, but when I heard she had a baby, I went to the hospital to see them. The sight of a newborn baby, my child, was strange to me. Barbara named her Brenda. I didn't think I was capable of any emotions at that time, but something made me want to keep our Brenda in my life. I agreed to marry Barbara. A preacher married us in my mother's living room, and we moved into a small apartment downstairs. That arrangement lasted about 3 months until the street pulled me back. I abandoned them. My only feeling of relief and release in those years came from racing horses with my friends. There was a stable in St. Anne Street that housed horses used to pull buggies for tourists in the French Quarter. At night, my friends and I stuck into the stable, took the horses, and walked them to the park. We didn't have saddles, so we raced bareback. We ran those horses until their mouths foamed. When I was riding horses, it was the only time in my life that I wasn't afraid of going to jail. My only fear was not being able to ride horses anymore. Chapter 3, Car Chase. In the early spring of 1965, I was in love with a girl named Pee Wee. We heard about a party in a big community center in Houma, Louisiana, a small parish about 60 miles from New Orleans, and wanted to go. I drove Pee Wee, her little brother Harold, and some friends up there in a car they told me belonged to their uncle. I'd just turned 18. While we were inside the community center, Pee Wee's brother snuck out and took the car for a joyride. He hit another car while he was out. Nobody was injured, but somebody got the license plate number of that car he was speeding away and reported it to the police. He came back to the party and didn't say a word. Afterwards, I was driving us back to New Orleans when a state trooper started blaring a siren and flashing lights behind us. As I was getting ready to pull over, Pee Wee's brother started yelling, "Don't pull over, don't pull over," from the backseat of the car. In the rearview mirror, I saw him waving his arms. "I stole this car," he yelled. Without a second hesitation, I swerved back onto the highway and pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. Fueled by the fear of being arrested for driving a stolen car, I inevitably led a sheriff's squad car on a 17-mile high-speed chase down the freeway, plowing through barricades erected by the sheriff deputies or the state troopers ahead of us. I was weaving in and out of traffic through Raceland when Pee Wee, who had been screaming this whole time, grabbed the steering wheel suddenly and jerked it to the right. The car made a sharp turn into an embankment of a canal and flew over the water, landing on the two front tires, breaking the axle between them in half and somehow ending upright. For a moment, nobody moved. We were on the other side of the canal from the sheriff deputy and state troopers. When I looked over, they were already out of the cars yelling at us to get out, waving their guns. We opened the car door and ran as fast as we could in different directions. I came to a garage behind a house and found a large dollhouse inside where I hid, pulling dolls on top of me. Sheriff's deputies came in and looked around and left. Sometime later, I climbed out of the dollhouse and walked out of the garage. As I looked around the corner, I saw Pee Wee, Harold, and others standing with state troopers. Pee Wee was crying. I didn't want them to go to jail. I walked over to the troopers and surrendered myself. After we were arrested, they brought us to the Theobod Thibodaux jail. The next day, I told them I stole the car and that we were joyriding and nobody knew anything about it. Pee-wee, her brother, and their friends were released. They charged me with auto theft, resisting arrest, hit and run, and speeding. The police said I was going 108 miles an hour. I took a plea bargain and was sentenced to 2 years in the Doe's jail, or Thibodaux. They made me a trustee, which meant I had more freedom of movement than other prisoners. I was put on a work crew cutting grass and picking up trash along the highway. After a couple weeks, I ran away. As usual, I wasn't thinking ahead. I didn't have a plan. I just wanted to go home. I noticed that the back door of the jail was kept open until midnight. There was an old unlocked bicycle in the backyard. The guards watched TV with the inmates every night. I left one night while the prisoners and sheriff deputy watched a program on TV. I got on the bike and headed for the highway. After pedaling a couple hours, I was tired and looking for a place to pull over when I saw that there were some trucks and equipment in a gravel pit off the side of the road. I thought I could take a nap in the cab of the cement mixer, so I pedaled over, climbed in, and laid down on the seat. That's when I saw the keys in the ignition. I taught myself how to shift gears in the cement mixer by trial and error while driving to New Orleans. I could only go about 10 miles per hour, but it was better than riding a bike. When I was almost home, I pulled up to a light on St. Bernard and Claiborne, and a police car pulled up right next to me. From the corner of my eye, I saw the cops do a double take when they saw me, a skinny black kid driving a cement mixer in the middle of the city. They waved me over. I made a left on St. Bernard and pulled over, and then jumped out running. They got out of their car with guns drawn and started firing at me. I ran up neutral ground on Claiborne and got myself to an alley beside a house where I could jump fences and lose them. When I stopped to catch my breath, I realized I left my wallet on the dashboard of the cement mixer. I didn't hide. That's how stupid I was. I was sitting on the front steps of a friend's house in the 6th Ward with her kid on my lap the next day when an unmarked police car filled with detectives from the Thibodaux and New Orleans turned the corner. We saw each other at the same time. I couldn't run with her little kid on my lap, so I stayed where I was. They got out of the car with their guns in their hands and walked over. Well, said one of them, holding my wallet, Mr. Woodfox. They handcuffed me, put me in the car, and beat the shit out of me on the way to the central lockup because I had led the police on a chase. I was sent back to the Thibodaux. No idea how to say that. In charge with escape, theft, driving without a license, resisting an officer, and speeding. The judge told me I had a choice. I could do 4 years in Houma City Jail or 2 years at the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, with an option to transfer out of minimum security to Quincy Jail in 90 days if I was well behaved. I'd seen guys in my neighborhood come back from Angola throughout my childhood. They were given the highest respect. I thought it would be an honor to go there. I chose Angola. That is all for today.